Hello and welcome to Living the Dream for General Practitioners, the podcast for doctors and clinic leaders who want to learn about pathways, strategies and opportunities for living and working in Australia. Join me, Gemma Gough, and my expert guests as we share stories, unlock the secrets to recruitment success, share tips for moving across the world, navigating new cultures and so much more. This show is brought to you by Health Recruitment Australia. Now sit back, relax and enjoy this episode. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7, the penultimate in our GP Recruitment Fundamentals podcast series. Today I am thrilled to be joined by Denzil Cheesley from Ray White Seaford, a very successful real estate company here in South Adelaide. Denzil was born in Devon in the southwest of England and migrated to Australia in 2000 at the age of 25. Following his father who had migrated in the 1980s. After a spell of working in the family wine industry in Wollonga, in 2001, Denzil studied for his real estate licence before embarking on a career in real estate sales in 2002. He is now 48 and lives at Christie's Beach with his partner Kelly and Cheddar the Corgi. He works hard and enjoys his job. He also loves the outdoors, mainly in the forms of hiking, travelling, kayaking, or just a run on the beach with Cheddar, and he likes football, the Pommy version. Denzil will be sharing his knowledge on all things real estate in the hope to provide you with information to make finding your new home in Australia more achievable. Denzil, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Well, let's jump right in. We've got lots of questions to ask you today. So certainly one of the questions that I'm asked most by GPs that are considering a move to Australia is what's the property market looking like at the moment? I appreciate it's ever changing, so but perhaps you could share with our listeners what the market's doing at the moment.
It's hot, especially in South Australia, Western Australia, Brisbane. That's another hot market. It's been, I think, it's mirrored the UK a little bit in that it's been a seller's market for about 3.5 years. We all expected the COVID downturn. It sparked a boom. Go figure. So it's not the mad frenzy in Adelaide that it was maybe 2 years, 3 years ago, but it's still multiple offers on most properties and most of them selling within a week or two, and renting is the same yet. They're not hanging around.
Yeah, right. So I thought we'd talk about sort of renting and then buying a home as two separate parts. So if a GP decides that their best option when they arrive into Australia is to rent, as many do, because they like to obviously have a look around, find an area that they're comfortable with, good schools and things like that. So how does the process work in regards to securing a rental? So how do they sort of join mailing lists and things like that?
Yeah. Almost all properties with all property managers do go online on the usual website portals, realestate.com.au, domain.com.au. There's not much that flies under the radar. So you can certainly go on agents' notification lists, but the properties are still going to get advertised in almost all circumstances. So I would say to somebody that is eyeing up a move to Australia and it wants to pre-apply for a rental, keep an eye on the area that you've selected that you think you want to be in. Keep an eye almost daily on new releases. There will almost always, there'll be an online application in almost all cases. They can submit an application without seeing, but the properties will be viewed. There'll be an open time for 20 minutes or so in 3 days' time, and they will expose the property before looking at applications. So that would be the case. But submit an application. You can do that without viewing the property. The main thing, I think, is to have good backup with references. Landlords do have a choice at the moment. There's usually, just like there's 3 or 4 offers on every house for sale, there's usually 3 or 4 applicants very quickly for every rental. So credentials such as a good reference, and if they're not in town, they usually like to see proof of income, savings. Landlords like to see that somebody has the capability always of paying the rent. So if there are savings in your account, a screenshot of a bank balance gives great weight to an application. Okay,
excellent. So the sort of rental process in Australia is obviously slightly different to overseas in the sense that, as you mentioned, they do like to have applicants to visit the property. So that's obviously very difficult for a GP and their family if they're coming from overseas. So is there sort of a workaround for a GP, or is it a case of they have to kind of come in on an Airbnb type thing and then find a property?
You might be at a slight disadvantage having not seen the property, but I think if you explain your situation, that I'm a GP, I get on a plane, my family and I get on a plane in 3 weeks. We want somewhere, so certainly say we want somewhere for the first 12 months, not the first 3 months, because all landlords like to have a secure lease for 12 months at a time at least. They don't want to think you're going to break lease in 3 months because you're going to buy immediately, because they generally will have to pay the relet costs. Though breaking lease, you'd probably be up for that. But yeah, I would suggest just explain your situation if you can't physically see the property. If you've still got the proof of bank balance and the reasons behind it, it shouldn't disadvantage you as an applicant much.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. So how does the rental sort of tenancy arrangement work in regards to the term, a deposit, insurance, rates, inspection? Like, what would somebody be up for, if they decide rental's the way to go?
Usually, for most properties, a 6 weeks rent worth of bond is payable up front, and that's lodged with the residential tenancies. Okay, so that isn't held by the landlord or the property manager, that's held basically by the government. And that's just in case you fail to pay rent, run away, damage the property. But a 6 week bond, also normally rents are paid 2 weeks up front. So you really want 8 weeks worth of rent to lay down at the outset of a lease.
Okay, that's really helpful. And what sort of is a standard term? Is it 12 months is pretty typical?
I would say 90% of rental leases are on a 12-month basis. Some might be 6 months, but that creates a little bit more uncertainty for the landlord if they're a long-term investor, and a little bit of uncertainty for the tenant if they think, well, we want to bed in for 12 months, not have to move potentially after 6. So you would find easily 90% of leases are 12 months at a time. Sometimes a long-term investor would say, well, they'd be interested in 24 months. Now, a GP moving to the country probably doesn't want to bed in for 2 years. 6 to 12 months is going to be enough for them to decide where they want to live and buy in most cases.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. What about things like insurance? So landlords have insurance. What would that cover? And then what would our GPs need to get insurance for?
The tenant, the GP, would only need insurance for their contents. Yeah, landlords are responsible for council rates, building insurance. They usually will have landlord insurance as well in case of loss of rent, but that's their business. They may not. I believe in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, in most cases, the tenant pays the council rates. I think, could be wrong, but that's not the case in Australia.
Okay, good to know. Okay, super. And what about inspections? That's something that's, done here frequently, isn't it? Is it quarterly inspections for most?
Quarterly is standard, yeah.
Okay.
Inspections 4 times a year where the property manager will send you out a week's notice. You don't have to be there. The tenant doesn't have to be there. The property manager will have a key. They'll say, we'll come through on this day or around this time. They'll be there for 10, 15 minutes. Just make sure there's no damage or no.
So what happens when a lease is due for renewal? So is it sort of automatic after those 12 months, or is there rate increases likely? What if a GP or a landlord doesn't want to extend the lease? Like how does that work?
After that 12-month lease, it's only renewed with the written agreement of both the landlord and the tenant. Many occasions, the tenant, so a notice will go out usually about 4 to 6 weeks prior to the end of lease renewal option, because most landlords are long-term landlords. They want a good tenant to stay. If the market dictates, they'll put the rent up $20 a week. If the market doesn't dictate, well, they can't really do it. There'll be a 4 to 6 week notice of lease renewal, which usually the landlord will want to take up. The tenant might decide, you know what, we've just put a contract on a property, we won't be renewing, we're buying.
Makes sense. Okay. So if the either party decides that's not what they want to do, and there was sort of open houses, is that done when the tenants leave the property, or is that something that's done while the tenants are still there?
The property manager will often request, can we do a few viewings in the week or two before you vacate? And it's just down to verbal agreement whenever's convenient. In most situations, a tenant would say, yeah, you can do a viewing at this time on this day. We'll make sure it's tidy. We'll make sure the kids are out. We'll pop out. But that's just down to communication. A property manager, I believe, does have the right to come through if they serve, I think it's still correct, 7 to 14 days written notice. But, there wouldn't normally be a problem with that. Usually the tenant would say, yeah, no problem. We'll pop out for dinner that afternoon. Go on, so. Now, if it's at the end of the lease, less motivation for the tenant to be cooperative there. But if the tenant is breaking lease, they will be very cooperative because a tenant breaking lease is up for loss of rent and relet costs. So they'll say, yeah, sure, show potential tenants through, because that tenant, if they're breaking the lease, will want as seamless as possible a transition between them going out and a new tenant going in. So they're not up for 3 weeks lost rent. They're only 5 days. You know what I mean? So in that situation, the tenant, if they're breaking lease, will say, yeah, show groups through. We don't want the place empty. It'll cost us because we've broken the lease.
Yeah, okay, well, that makes sense, yeah. So what about sort of subletting? Is that something that's permitted?
No. Any change to the lease once a tenant is in has to be agreed in writing. Now, a tenant might move in and 3 months later, they might apply, we want to get a puppy or a kitten. And that has to be approved through the property manager by the landlord. And if you're being a great tenant, and if the landlord isn't too particular, they might say, yeah, they're being good tenants. Let them get, or they're family members now coming over from the UK as well. Can we, add them to the lease? It would normally be approved if you're already being a good tenant, I would say. But any sublet or changes to people on the lease needs to be approved.
Okay. We've had some feedback from some GPs that, they have to get in writing permission for things like putting pictures on walls and things like that. Is that the case as well? Like if they want to sort of make it their own, that they would need to?
Yeah. Look, if it's nails going into walls, sometimes tenants will just do it, but you should just seek permission.
Sure, courtesy call kind of thing.
And there are so many variables there. Sometimes you might have particular landlords who say, I don't want them to touch a thing. But sometimes you'll have a cruisy landlord to say, yeah, look, they seem like good people. They're not going to do anything silly. Tell them they can make sensible changes. So there's no firm answer.
Okay, that's fair. Anything else you think our listeners should be aware of in terms of the rental side of things?
I don't think so. I think on a personal basis, look, if you've already done a recce trip, which I think a lot of people that migrate have done so, in my experience of seeing English buyers at open inspections for houses that I'm selling, most of them have been to Adelaide before. I would say 60, 70% at least. And if that's the case, you kind of know the areas, you know where you want to be. If you've never been to the country or the city, I kind of think, although it's not so economically viable, get an Airbnb for a month first. Taking out a lease and then landing and thinking, we don't even like this area, not so bad if you're renting, but if you've bought as well, you're sort of committed. So I sort of think, although, to take a rental for an Airbnb or a short-term holiday place for 3 weeks, very costly. But at least you'll get to learn the demographics before you start your new job, before you commit to a lease or a purchase.
Yeah, that's great advice. All right, so moving on to then buying a property. What would the considerations be for a GP who would prefer to buy a home from overseas? So they're in the UK and they want to buy something in Australia, versus when they are in Australia. Is it smart to do this? Is there sort of tax implications and are they better to wait till they get into Australia? How would that work?
Again, I think it depends on whether they have been to the city or the country before, and do they know where they're buying. Somebody who's been to Adelaide, for example, for a few weeks in the past might have really fallen for some areas they might be comfortable with buying. My partner and I, we've got a few investment properties interstate, which we're not so emotionally involved in. We don't live in them. But we have always flown to see, even though they're investments. I just personally would rather try before I buy. Look, I have over the years sold at least a couple of properties to people who haven't even arrived in the country yet and don't really know where they're buying. And look, it's just their mindset. They're just thinking, well, it looks like a good area. We know we've got a friend that lives a few suburbs away. We're comfortable buying. But personally, yeah.
So what about things like the tax and things? Is that something that you're aware of? Like, is it are there financial benefits to buying from overseas or, in Australia? Is there sort of things that, buyers could be aware of?
You'll pay stamp duty, and stamp duty roughly dollar for dollar is expensive compared to the UK. I think it's about double.
Yeah, right.
So if you buy, for example, a £400,000 home, I looked up and I think the stamp duty for someone who is not a first home buyer or it's not an investment, I think they'll pay about £7,500, which is about $13,000. That if you buy that house, which is £400,000 in dollars, that's about $760,000 Aussie dollars. You'll pay stamp duty instead of £7,500, $13,000. You'll probably pay about $30,000. It's more than double, and they vary from state to state. South Australia has one of the highest per dollar stamp duty, but they're all roughly within a zone. But yeah, just factor that in. If you are not yet a permanent resident, some GPs might come in on permanent residency granted already. Some might be temporary. I don't know. If you're not a permanent resident, there is stamp duty loading as well. So the government will tax you higher if you're not a permanent resident, if you're on, say, a 4-year initial visa. So some people do rent for a few years until their permanent visa comes through, because otherwise the stamp duty load, I think it increases by about 40-50%.
Okay. See, that's really helpful. That's great to know. Can you break down the steps in regards to buying a home? So let's say the GP is currently in a rental and has decided they've now got their permanent residency, so they want to buy. What are the first things that they should do?
The majority of buyers, it's a very different market, and I didn't work in the UK in real estate, but it's a very different kind of environment. It's more streamlined. I don't think, you in the UK, you can get gazumping right up until the last day of the exchange. That must be so stressful. I know, and I think there's a couple of states in Australia, because every state has its own legislation. There's a couple of states that are a bit like that. South Australia is streamlined. When you might put a contract on a property, might be subject to finance approval. We normally allow 14 days thereabouts for formal loan approval. But once the deposit is paid, the buyer's through their 2 business day cooling off period and their finances approved, they are buying it. No one can gazump. Safe for everybody. I think it's a very much a seller's market. You've got to be quick. So if you're in the country and you're in a rental and you're ready to buy, go to the opens. Look at the properties online. New ones come online every week. They'll be open Saturday and often open Monday or Tuesday evening in many circumstances. Get to one of those opens, because in this market, if you find a property that after a week or two no one's offered on, you've got to think, why is that? You expect to be competing. So be prepared to have your finances in line and be ready if you see the one that you really want to make an offer.
Okay. And how does the offer process work? What do they need to do? Is it sort of written, or do they give the agent a call, or how does that work?
Yeah. Most buyers, so at open inspections, and properties are almost always open for inspection in Australia. That can be a bit different from the UK as well. At open inspections, I will check everybody in digitally. They'll get a link to the property with an offer form, copy of the title, a rental appraisal in case they're an investor. And I'll also have hard copies of the offer forms at opens, as well as the brochure. Take everybody's details. Normally, if somebody's interested in a property, before I can follow them up on a Monday, they will often flick an offer through to me on that offer form via text, screenshot, SMS, whatever, or via email by the Monday. And we will then talk with all offerers. And I say all offerers because in this market, it's very rare that I have a property that drags and only has one offer. There's usually the 3 new releases I've had this weekend and open again at the start of the week. We had 9 offers on the property at Aberfoyle Park, 8 on Norfolk Vale. I've currently got 3 on the one at Seaford, and I'm expecting 1 or 2 more. It's like that, especially in the under $750,000 bracket, where there's a lot of congestion amongst buyer activity. So speak with the agent,
Yeah. And what are they looking for? The sort of the high, that the seller wants the most money, or do they want sort of cash offers, or are they looking for, the first time buyers, so there's no chain? What sort of is, what tempts the seller?
Money first, conditions close second. Yeah, definitely. If there's a lot of buyers in this competitive market that are borrowing from a bank, but almost all of them, but if they are confident, first-time buyers as well as second or third-time buyers, if they're confident in their communications with their lender that they're a dead cert for the loan, they're removing the finance clause and going unconditional. So, yeah, and just putting the risk of finance with themselves, not the seller. And I've done that as well. If you speak to your bank, and even if you're borrowing 70, 80%, if your lender or your finance broker says, oh, you're good for the money, you've got a big deposit, you've got a solid job you're in, a lot of buyers are removing the finance clause. So if somebody sells in the UK and is lucky enough to have £100,000 that they bring over, and a good job that they've now been in for 3 to 6 months, so the banks will all look at them. They often won't for 3 to 6 months. If they are 100% sure that they can borrow the rest and be sure, then a lot of buyers would make an unconditional offer, because that, as well as the money, is a close second in what appeals to the seller.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. All right. That's really helpful. What are the big no-nos for GPs that they should be aware of when buying a home in Australia? Is there just anything that they just might not know that they should know?
No, I don't think so. It is a more streamlined process. Agents are, for the most part, very ethical people. We seem to be second and third only to used car salesmen, and no disrespect to them either, but that's just the way it is. But no, I find most agents that I've dealt with in my 22 years of selling property in this area are really good people, and they will answer your questions honestly and ethically, and they're working for the seller. Their job is to get as much money from the buyer as possible. So don't be surprised if they try and pull more money out of you. That's their job. But they will, they're normally very honest, ethical people. So I don't think there's any pitfalls. Speak to a conveyancer first, if you like. So a conveyancer, I think you might use a solicitor in the UK, property solicitor. Conveyancer in South Australia, other states, they use the term property solicitor. But they are an independent. But once you've got a contract on a property, they will organise the transfer of funds one way and the title the other way. And, if you feel like you want a bit of independent confidence, a British buyer might speak to a conveyancer first.
Yeah, that's helpful. All right. So I'm looking at my list of questions. There were quite a few from our doctors. There was, just essentially, is there anything else that you think a GP should consider when buying a home? And is there anything else you think a GP should be aware of in regards to anything real estate related that we haven't already covered today?
I think for me, and this is just personal choice, bed in first. I mentioned that the stamp duty dollar for dollar is roughly double what it is in the UK. You don't want to buy a home on a whim, maybe without seeing the home or the area, and realise within a few months, this isn't the right place for myself and my family for the next 5 to 10 years, and want to sell and buy again. There's a big cost in the transaction. So I think personally, and it's not the right answer, but it's my own personal choice, I think if I were coming to the country anew and I didn't know the areas and I didn't know the lifestyle that comes with that area or the feel of that area, and we're all different. We all want different feel from a home and from a location. Bed in for a few weeks. You're likely to land in the country and you're not going to start work the next day. Your kids probably aren't in school the next week. Use that few weeks to get an Airbnb, as costly as it might be, because it might be a big saving in the long run when you buy the right home and pay stamp duty and sales costs once in a decade, not twice.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice.
And bed in and learn your surrounds and see what see what areas that feels right for you and your family.
And that's one of the things we talk about in one of our earlier podcasts, is about why is a GP looking to relocate? Was it to get a better work-life balance? So do they want to be, taking up a hobby like surfing, so they want to be by the beach, or do they want country living and have a hobby farm? So you're absolutely right, is to go explore first when you get here before making that big commitment. So that's great advice.
There's an element in me that where I've lived, and I've always lived in the same zone, but I've looked for an element of character and charm that I think you don't always get in a newer country. We've got space and environment and free, it's great here, but sometimes Australia can lack that character. And I've looked at certain zones that feel like a little bit of, not a little bit of England, but just an area where there feels like a community. Yeah. And funnily enough, there's quite a few Poms that live around me, so maybe they've looked the same.
That's right. Absolutely. All right. Well, if there's nothing else you want to add, Denzil, I thank you for joining me today. This has been really helpful. I think that it will be a big help for our listeners, taking that step closer to planning their move down under. So if any of our listeners would like to get in touch and ask you any questions about their move or seek guidance and support in regards to securing a home, how would they do that?
Certainly. Give me a call, 0422 300 718. My email, Denzil, that's DENZIL .Cheesley, CHEESLEY @raywhite.com. Our office is in the Seaford Meadows Shopping Centre. But yeah, any questions that anybody has, any of your listeners have, I'd love to assist. Hopefully it provides a bit of advice and assurance to somebody. And look, I've had friends as well in various careers that almost made the move that didn't, and they get to their 40s and 50s and think, what if you don't settle, you can always go back, but don't get to 65 and wonder whether you should have moved to Australia when you had the chance. You can always go back after. Do remember as well that most of us get very homesick in the first year. About 18 months is the period that you should truly judge whether you're happy. There's a time period when you stop doing the conversion to pounds in your head. That's when you bet. It's true. It's about 18 months. The first year you go, what's that in pounds? Is that too much? You stop doing that after about 18 months, and that's when you start to feel
like an Aussie.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been lovely to catch up with you. And if our listeners want to reach out to Denzil, then please do so. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Gemma. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Living the Dream for General Practitioners. Don't forget to subscribe on your favourite podcast player so you don't miss an episode. At Health Recruitment Australia, we want to see more happy GPs, thriving medical practices and healthy communities. If you'd like to join us on our mission, visit healthrecruitmentaustralia.com.au to explore opportunities and get in touch. Thanks for listening.